Alexa, does God support slavery in the Old Testament?
Sorry, I don't know that.
Huh. What's up, everybody? I'm Josh, and welcome to Christian Sophistry, taking apologetics to the next level. And if you are interested in engaging in this conversation, go ahead and think about hitting the subscribe button down below and the bell notification so you don't miss anything. Okay, so Christians throughout history, even some recent history, have used passages in the Old Testament and even some in the New Testament to support a contemporary practice of slavery. In these passages, there are clear guidelines about how to do slavery, and in some of them, God even directly permits slavery. Now, if all of that is true, shouldn't we as Christians be advocates for slavery if we want to be consistent with what Scripture says? And this is not by any means a stupid question. Both Christians and critics raise issues about the Bible in this area. And I like to think that I'm pretty open about how I judge arguments that come from critics, but by no means do I think that this is a necessarily dumb question for them to ask. Now, some might argue that it's a rather uninformed question, but that's definitely not the same thing. It can definitely be handled in a dumb way, but once we look at the text exegetically, then we get a clear picture of what God's position on this issue is. So there are two factors to remember when answering this question. The first one is that the term slavery does not mean the same thing that it does today as it did in the context that it's written in the Old Testament. And the second factor is that God is not endorsing slavery, He is regulating it. Now, let's start with the first factor and sort of characterize slavery in its particular context. But before I do that, let me give a quick disclaimer. This section of the video is in no way me endorsing slavery or arguing that slavery is a good thing in any context. It's just me explaining what slavery means in the context of the Old Testament, of the Bible, instead of us reading into what we think slavery means based on our cultural perceptions and historical understanding. For some of us, we unintentionally associate words like slavery with our own historical and cultural context, and then we project those understandings into what we read in the Bible. So in order to avoid that, I want to, in this section of the video, sort of separate some of those cultural differences and distinguish the two. So first of all, and most importantly, the criteria for slavery was not based on racial premises. Slaves in this time frame were not identified as slaves inherently because of their racial background. Although, to be fair, some people were born into slavery, and a lot of the times large amounts of specific people groups were brought into slavery as a result of war. But that does kind of bring me to my second point here, which is that slavery in this context was not seen as evil because it was an economic necessity. I think we live in a more entitled society where we don't quite realize that, logistically speaking, people could not have just chosen not to be slaves. When your community has been destroyed by war or other kinds of means, you don't really have a whole lot of options. It's either go into slavery or die because there's no resources to reach you for you to sustain yourself. The conditions of the ancient Near East were so difficult that a lot of people even voluntarily went into slavery, or sometimes just to pay off a debt. So slavery as it was saved the lives of a lot of people in lower socioeconomic classes because they just didn't have the resources to live. It's not like they could have just gone out and got a job somewhere else or worked somewhere else or found other ways to sustain themselves. There isn't a whole lot of options in this cultural context. And now on to the second factor. Because of the regulations that God puts in place within this culture, slavery advances beyond the general culture in order to protect the humanity of people that were in this system. And because of these regulations, slavery is not like the slavery that we know in our recent history. Now, slavery as we have seen it in the Western world deprives people of their humanity. But the Bible actually protects against those injustices that happen to people that are in this slavery system. For example, in Exodus 21, it regulates the fact that masters can only hold their slaves for a maximum of 6 years unless he or she chooses to stay longer. Also, slaves were not obligated to stay with the master that abused them physically. In Leviticus 25, it demonstrates that slaves are to be treated as hired workers and not as property. So, if the slavery that we see in the early Western world were consistent with the Bible, it would look a whole lot different than it did. But again, slavery is not good in any context, and that's not what I'm trying to communicate here. What I am trying to communicate is that God is actually making progressive improvements upon the existing system of slavery, and he is protecting the humanity of the people that find themselves in these circumstances. And even though the slavery that God is permitting here is not anything close to the slavery that we see in our recent history, the automatic follow-up question that I think we all find ourselves asking is, why doesn't God just abolish it altogether if it is in fact not good? And my answer to that would be, aside from the fact that slavery served a purpose of providing a means for people to live in that time, I also think that it wouldn't have been possible to simply abolish it from culture altogether in that society. In a lot of ways, I think it would have been like trying to abolish cars in the modern world. People would just not have given them up. It'd be much easier to take progressive steps in order to make a good change in society. And I think that's what God does here in the Old Testament. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question. How do you answer the question of slavery in the Bible? Or if you're a critic, what other concerns do you have that go beyond what I've answered in this video? It is an ongoing discussion that I think we should be open to talking to, so let me know in the comment section down below. And if you thought this video was valuable, go ahead and like and share this video with your friends. Otherwise, that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, thanks for arguing with me.